Hello, no. Hello, hello. I think. Hello. Hello. Nine one two. Oh, পঢ়ি পেলাই আপোনাৰ ক'ব 912 75 912 75 11 81. Hello, 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 hello. पिच बहुत लो है. Hello, hello, hello.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the talk by Professor Arupjyoti Saikia on behalf of the Department of History in association with the Archives of Contemporary India at Ashoka. Gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Saikia, who's been our guest here at Ashoka the last few days. It is his first, but we hope not his last visit to our campus. Professor Saikia, as all of you know, is an eminent historian with a remarkable record of publishing on the history of Assam, but books which touch on much larger themes. Professor Saikia has studied at Guwahati University. He is also somewhat unusual. He's an alumnus of 3 universities in the city of Delhi, Jamia Millia Islamia, JNU, and the University of Delhi, at the last of which he completed his doctorate. He has taught at Cotton College, Guwahati, and for many years now, he has been at the IIT Guwahati, where he's a professor of history in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. He's been visitor at Yale, also at Cambridge, and at SOAS. His first book, Jungles, Reserves, Wildlife, was published 2007, 2005. But he is widely known for his very detailed works, The Forests and Ecological History of Assam, 2011, A Century of Protest, Peasant Politics in Assam since 1900, published in 2014, which was reworked monograph based on his doctoral research, and a book which won wide acclaim, The Unquiet River, A Biography of Brahmaputra, 2019. We are here, of course, today because of a very significant book which is just out, The Quest for Modern Assam, A History, 1942 to 2000, Penguin 2023. A couple of days ago, my distinguished colleague in environmental studies, Dr. Barua, said of Professor Saikia that he writes these books which are 700-800 pages every few years. We have no idea how he does it. I'm not sure he's going to share the secret, but it's a great privilege to welcome you here. The title, of course, is the same as the book, The Quest for Modern Assam, A History, 1942 to 2000. So please join me in according him a very warm welcome.
Thank you, Mahesh. Thank you, Ashoka. Thank you all of you for coming, those who are online. This is not the right time to speak, but anyway, this is absolutely, I'm privileged to speak all of before you. You know, this book is about Assam after independence. This is how I started, that I should write something about Assam's post-colonial journey. But somehow I ended up going before. I started my book in 1942. You must be thinking why I started in 1942, but I also concluded in 2000, because I thought that present century still requires more time, more reflection, and I don't think we do have a very convincing archive to write about this particular time, and it is not the historian's privilege anymore. But I began in 1942 for 2 specific reasons. 1942 to 1944, this was an extraordinary time for India's Northeast. Second World War, the great migration from Burma in 1942, the great Quit India movement of 1942, and the actual war, Second World War, the Imphal and Kohima, who is at a great impact. Imphal was not part of Assam, but Kohima was one of the districts of Assam. But the war and its devastation, human devastations, ecological devastations, the economic consequences, the 1942 to 1947, this is an unending delay. And 42 to 47, this 5 years of period, it seems like it was almost a long century. So many events, unexpected turn of the situations, bigger political developments as the imperial power, it began to withdraw, and so many things were happening around this period. It requires fresh investigations. My predecessors, they have definitely done about this time, but it was not in the context of bringing all these events together. For example, 1942 and 44, this was the time when all Muslim League and Congress, they intensified their claim for the future control and governance of India. Assam is going to be part of Pakistan. That became very clear. It was spelled out, but it also created enormous amount of anxieties, negotiations back and forth. But it was also the British design for that reason. The British imperial officials from early 1940s, till 1946, they have a different plan for those reasons. They thought the parts of the Assam's hill districts and parts of Burma's western districts, it can be combined together and to be created an independent sovereign territory. That plan was debated, discussed, but that was also a major cause of concern for the local residents. So how Assam negotiated with that? So I began with that story. That's why Assam's history of independence, it does not really begins in 1947. It begins a little bit earlier. So that's why I began in 1942. I came up to 2000. But this long 60 years was enormously complicated. There are many directions through his historical, economic, political, environmental developments went on. Ups and downs, upheavals. It was a drama almost every year. For example, post 1947, Assam actually witnessed two major wars. One of 1962, the Indo-China War, the 1971, the Indo-Pakistan War, the Bangladesh Liberation Movement, Liberation War, right? Everything was basically unfolding in Assam's geography. So how does one bring those things? But there are also intense negotiations between Assam and also government of India in terms of its claim over resources. For example, who will own Assam's the petroleum reserves? Who owns those things? Those were still unresolved debates. The 1950s, obviously Assam created enormous difficulty for the Indian government about the claims and stakes over these resources. But also it is a question of internal politics and also the ambition and aspirations of the local residents, emerging elites, middle class, urban populations. They have also their tastes, their desires. For example, what should be the method and the pattern or the character of the Assamese language, which is one of the dominant language, powerful, also one of the oldest language of that region. How prose should be written? What kind of prose? Is it the prose that we are following in the 1930s? Is it the romantic prose, which largely follow a mythical legend, or they subscribe to the larger stories of the legends and something? Or should we go for more tight prose? Or what kind of poetry should we write? Those debates were also unfolding in the 1940s, 50s onward, right? How the what kind of women roles the women should play, right? In the 19th century, late 19th century, the role for the women was well defined by the Assamese elites of the 19th century, that their role is largely inside the kitchen. But I think making a dramatic departure, both because of the women's, their own historical experience of the early 20th century, their massive engagement in the anti-imperial movement, also the larger economic and the cultural transitions that were happening. It was a remarkable transitions. 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, Assamese women, they began to participate in the political processes and bureaucracy, into the science educations, and also leading public intellectuals. All these developments, 60s, 70s, remain intensified. Early 80s, we saw one of the largest popular unrest in the history of modern India. In terms of its duration, in terms of its ability to capture the imaginations of millions and millions of populations, right? So how does one understand those small events, not small in terms of their durations, but in terms of its impacts, in terms of its ability to change the course of public debates in India? How does one bring those events into a larger historical narrative? But more importantly, those are much more recent developments. Many people who participated in those processes, they're still alive. How does historian write about them? One has to be extremely careful, sensitive, because these are extremely sensitive subjects. So, but there are other developments. For example, the life and times of the hill residents. There were for example, the Khasi, Jayantia, and Garo Hills, which is now the Meghalaya, right? How those districts, they decided that they would not be part of Assam anymore, right? Was it environmental? Was it geographical? Was it political? Was it economic? Those questions also needed to be addressed. Then the questions of Naga Hills, right? It was in critical districts of Assam, and it was also an important participant in Assam's recent histories, right? So why Nagaland decided not to be part of Assam anymore? In fact, on the 14th of August, 1947, a section of the leaders of the Naga Hills, they wrote to the British Prime Minister saying that we have declared our independence from today. Obviously, a lot of negotiation back and forth went on with Gandhi, Nehru, and others. Right? So how do I write their history along with the history of Assam? Then there is another hill district, which became part of Assam in the late 19th century, the Lusai Hills, which is presently the Mizoram, right? So why Mizoram decided not to be part of India, part of Assam anymore? How does one bring the questions of ecological disasters, and how does one bring the history of the political leaders of India, their inability to comprehend and negotiate with these ecological disasters and its ramification in the local politics? For example, Eastern Himalaya. Eastern Himalaya was not essentially governed directly by the British government for a long period till 1930s. So now what will be the fate of the Eastern India, which is presently Arunachal Pradesh, how it became part of Assam and how it went out quickly, right? So those slippery, anxious moments also needed to be captured. But also life and times of many communities. Assam, there are more than 55 languages which are being spoken by range of communities and people. They are really powerful dominant languages. So everyone speaks different language, but how does one write the history of them, keeping the larger geography and the economic and political framework in one single entity? So these are also issues. And then also the issues of the life and times of these communities, how they were constantly negotiating with each other in terms of their stake in the larger state structure, in the bureaucracy, in the cultural schema of Assam. So this book essentially tells this larger history, but also how does this region also contributed to the making of the modern Republic of India, right? Republic of India is also constituted by many parts, many elements of Indian states, right? How Assam also to this idea of our intense negotiation back and forth diplomatically in terms of presence of military, presence of political rebels, and also different kind of cross-fertilization of ideas, right? So this book essentially tells this history. I end this book with a different kind of story. I discuss the history of one particular dance, how a dance which is called Satriya, which is an important dance largely propagated by Vaishnavite monasteries from the 15th century onward, how suddenly in the 20th century, this largely male-dominated dance it acquired a much more democratic form. There are many academic, intellectual, cultural exercises went into it in the remaking of this dance, and how this dance essentially helped Assam's final inclusion into the idea of Republic of India. In 2000, this dance was formally declared as one of the classical dance of India. So that process, it took a obviously long period. It was not that it happened in over a night. It happened over many, many decades of intense negotiations, political, intellectual, cultural. So the book ends by telling the history of this long journey. But in between, the elephants, the rhinos, the monsoon, everyone comes because they are also critical element in the making of that regions. So how Assam and government of India intensified their claim over rhinos, over elephant, or over river, over water, all those ideas are being spelled out as diligently as possible, as truthfully as possible. So this is how I enjoyed. By writing this book, I have drawn a range of archives. For instance, my greatest fate is in the Assamese literary archives, Bengali literary archives. Unfortunately, I don't know to read many languages of that reasons. I don't know Bodo language. I don't know the Mishing language, Kabi language. So, but still I tried my best to be sensitive to that archive, but also our formal archives. So this is what the book is about. I would like to read out briefly from parts of your from this book. For maybe you'd like it, maybe you dislike it, I don't know. Give me some liberty to read out parts, some passages from the chapter 1 of this book, which tells about the Second World War, how Second World War began to retreat from that region. As the Japanese troops retreated, they left behind a trail of gloom and misery. Most villagers did not have a harvest that winter. I'm talking about 1944. Bombs had destroyed their homes. An estimated 2 lakh people of the Naga Hills and Manipur had fled to escape the brutality of the Japanese troops. To deny the Japanese access to water and food, the Allied forces had poisoned water bodies, burned paddy stalks, houses in Manipur. Military camps were set up in parts of eastern Assam, and in Naga and Meitei villages were used for war operations. Homes and agricultural plots were seized and relocated. In Imphal, as many as 20,000 houses were occupied by the Allied army. This 20,000 needs to be given a perspective. These are thinly populated areas. So 20,000 means almost close to half of the populations, right? In the Naga Hills and in Manipur, rehabilitation began quickly. While the Indian government spelled out modalities of relief and rehabilitation, such measures were directly supervised by the Assam government. It was decided that relief, mostly in kind, should be fair, and I quote, and adequate, but without undue extravagance, so that, I quote, the people will rebuild their own houses, clear and repair their water courses, arrange for the resumption of cultivation, quote ends, without incurring any labor cost. Partial support came in the form of food, building materials, agricultural tools, seeds, and livestock. But an effective bureaucracy and the changing political scenario delayed the implementation of many relief programs. As villagers slowly returned to what remained of their homes, dispute arose. The war victims petitioned the Assam government, but as their claims were delayed or rejected, anger and bitter political debate arose. With the war on the eastern frontier, Assam's economy and resources had come under great pressure. I quote one of this report from that time: the clerical and the professional classes are having to tighten their belts every day. There has been a distinct upsetting of the economic balance, the quote ends. Very few got new opportunities for employment in either the military or civilian spheres. The oil refinery at Digboi was taken over by Allied forces, and Assam received a trifling sum in return from the Southeast Asia Command. Towns and civilian populations had to be guarded. Massive publicity campaigns were to be recreated. Refugees and armies had to be fed. A part of Assam's civil defense was maintained by the Assam Rifles and newly raised Assam Regiment. Large numbers from Naga, Kuki, Chin, and other hill tribes were conscripted for the war, and some were recruited as the Viceroy's commission officers. Finances had to be organized for them too. Assam also paid for several combat aircraft. Budget remained in deficit, but the government had few other options. Land revenue, the primary source of government earnings, had reached a tipping point. Sadullah, the premier of Assam, withdrew the existing practice of remission of land revenue, and this, along with the business done by the Forest Department, a new tax on petrol and contributions to the Assam War Fund helped partly bridge the deficit. Assam had an impressive financial growth during 1937 and 38, 1946 to 47, when both revenue collection and expenditure increased by more than 100%. But the war resulted in budget deficits both in Assam and Bengal. The presence of the Allied military further burdened and traumatized the people of Assam. Prices of everyday items went up manifold. Some gained quick profits, but in general, it was a worrying situation. Klo, Assam's governor, wrote, and I quote him, "Civil morale suffers in one of the districts from the disturbances involved by numerous requisitions of land, and in large part of the province from the locust-like habit of the forces, which render housing and supplies of all kinds very hard for civilians to procure. War had initially caused widespread panic, but most people had become resigned to living in a war zone." And I quote one such quote, "Military activity is now taken as so much for granted that when in one village where I was talking to the villagers, and I was quoting Governor Klo, an amphibious jeep driven by an apparently nude African went through, and I was among the few who turned to look at it," wrote Klo. The legacy of the war included environmental stress as well. In 1942, the respected science journal Nature had predicted that war may prove to be salvation of the Assam hill districts, since it would seem apparent that for military purposes, communications are being opened up in what has hitherto been wild marsh of more or less inaccessible hill tracks. This prediction of Nature journal had come very true, however, at a very big cost. The war, which alone created demands for millions of tons of poles, exerted an extraordinary and unprecedented burden on Assam's forest. Assam's forest department worked in close coordination with the military to accelerate the felling of the trees. By 1942, the Japanese occupation of Burma had disrupted the supply of rice to Assam's tea gardens. The problem was aggravated by the complete takeover of Assam's transport system by the military. To overcome the general food crisis, the Assam government in that year appointed Still Brothers and Company as official agents to purchase and distribute rice in Assam. As expected, the railway and the steamer companies made wartime profits. Jute producers benefited too, as prices spiral manifold. Some well-connected individuals, as depicted in a range of literary works, secured contracts for their construction of military barracks, roadways, airstrips, bridges, hospitals, and refugee camps, as well as for the supply of bamboos and thatch. Contractors and workers came from outside too, much to the displeasure of tiny Assamese bourgeoisie, to take advantage of these new economic opportunities. Hamburwa, who would later become a parliamentarian, captured the mood aptly when he observed that, and I quote him, "As war loomed large in the sky of Assam, Assam is gained a new sense of trade and commerce. Some of those who made money invested in the tea industry. Between 1943 and 1952, there was a five-fold increase in Assamese ownership of tea plantations, and the interest in the ownership spiked as there were clear indications of flight of foreign capital invested in the tea plantations after 1945. War also brought sudden financial prosperity, however trifling, to Assam's towns. Guwahati, capital of Assam, witnessed a dramatic increase in industrial and trading activities, leading to growth in employment. Of a population of 44,000 in 1945, the number of employed in trade and industries increased from 5,900 in 1938 to 9,900 during 1945 to 46. War left its scars on society. It transformed the geographical vacuum in India's northeast into a live frontier, dramatically changing the lives of all those who belonged there. The presence of large numbers of allied troops had led to intense, endless strife with the local people. Petty controversies between locals and allied soldiers over liquor and the prices in the marketplaces were widely reported. Further, molestation, rape, and murder of women by soldiers destroyed many families. These horrific experiences new to the people in that region found place in later literary works. In Birendra Kumar Bhattacharya's Yarangum Saringla, the female protagonist was captured by the Japanese soldiers and briefly stayed with one of them. This was also the beginning of the militarization of the area. The volume of modern weapons left behind here after the war was hard to estimate. Some of these weapons were brought home by villagers as trophies. Others lay buried and rusted. Some American soldiers clandestinely sold their weapons to private buyers. Loss or pilferage of military weapons and property with the active participation of soldiers had begun even before the war ended, and this fell to the hands of the communist guerrillas or political rebels and insurgents in the post-war era. Hello, and another section, another chapter. This is my chapter 2. It is about the chapter 3. It is about the partition. I'll not take long time. I'll take another 5-6 minutes. Weeks before partition, Assam government frantically wrote to the government of India. In fact, you know, the partition of Assam, it was the most unrecorded event. The way Assam was actually outside India briefly post-partition, because it got really disconnected because of the disruption in the railway and the steamer service. How Assam negotiated with that process, that is being told in this one of the chapter. So let me quickly read it out. Weeks before partition, indeed, the Assam government frantically wrote to the government of India expressing their fear that there would be no direct link between the road system in Assam and other parts of Indian Union. Making this nightmare a reality, Radcliffe's partition award mutilated Assam's geography. Its western frontier came to have limited access to mainland India, whether through road, river, or railway roads. The existing railway roads to Bengal now pass through East Pakistan, and the route links to northern Bengal were poor. The vibrant river route was also disrupted. Like the railways, this had to pass through East Pakistan territory. People who found themselves across the newly created border also worried about their political future. Some 50,000 to 60,000 people from the Garo community living in Bengal's Mymensingh district, which was contiguous to the Garo Hills in Assam, had demanded before a subcommittee formed by the Constituent Assembly, and the head of this committee, had demanded before a subcommittee formed by the Constituent Assembly that their areas be merged with Assam. Bodoloi, Assam's premier then, and the head of this committee had also written to Mountbatten endorsing this demand. However, the commission refused to concede to this demand, and the Garos living in the lowlands of East Pakistan came to be now part of East Pakistan. Over the years, East Pakistan would witness the birth of Garo identity politics. Assam had long been crucially dependent on the geography of East Bengal to sustain its trade and commerce. Partition, as well as we will see later in this book, destabilized this dependency, suddenly redefining the multifaceted economic, cultural, and ecological commonalities shared by Bengal and Assam over the centuries. The Brahmaputra River had the foremost role to play in defining these commonalities, having been vital in crafting the trade dynamics between the two regions. By the 19th century, Assam-Bengal relationship had already taken a new form. when Assam's commodity production became dependent on the Calcutta-based financial and business organizations. At independence, Assam, occupying 1/5 of India's total land surface, was approximately more than 200,000 square kilometers and ranked 50th in size. A 960-kilometer long border separated the state from East Pakistan. The border was fluid, dotted with rivers, river islands, hills, and marshy lands. Most of it, and I quote, lies along the foot of the hills. There are practically no roads and full of subsidiaries, no routes over the hills. A good part of the border is the river, which is so wide and full of subsidiary channels and islands that it is difficult to draw a line, wrote Assam's Chief Minister Vishnuram Medi, the successor to Gopinath Bordoloi, to Nehru. This muddy and riverine border with East Pakistan led to regular trouble as disputes over territory soon surfaced. There were claims and counterclaims about the territorial jurisdiction of India and East Pakistan, and the actual demarcation could not take place for several months due to rains. Clashes along the border and reports and rumors of harassment of citizens on both sides also became common. For several years, major tensions regarding the forest patches in the border of Kasar in the southern district of Assam. In January and February 1948, Prime Minister Nehru repeatedly cabled Liaquat Ali Khan, his counterpart in Pakistan, condemning East Pakistan government for attempting to encroach into the Paharia Hills Reserve Forest in southern Assam's Karimganj, which had been part of Sylhet district before partition. As India began the process of integration of princely states, Assam's Khasi and Jaintia hills posed a complex problem. The integration of Khasi chieftains or states with Indian territory, 25 in number, did not prove to be easy, albeit on a smaller scale as compared to the princely states like Jodhpur, Hyderabad. Some Khasi states like Cherrapunji, many of you know about this place, which at one time received the highest rainfall in the world, were still in touch with the officials of East Pakistan. The Shem, the traditional chief of Cherrapunji, was drawn to Pakistan as his private properties were in Sylhet, which has been now just partitioned and handed over to East Pakistan, but he decided to accede to India. Much to Bordoloi's unease, the state of Nongsten, rich in mineral resource, openly expressed its desire to join Pakistan. Its chief advisor had fled to Pakistan. Another state, Rambrai, also refused to join India. Many voiced their support for the merger too. A loosely organized platform called Khasi Jaintia Federated State National Conference, whose ranks were filled by the Congress leaders, was one of them. The Bodolo ministry was relieved when both these Khasi states finally signed the instrument of accession in March 1948. However, for another couple of years, communist leaders from Mymensingh in East Pakistan, who had a powerful presence in the Garo Hills, remained a matter of concern for the Union government of both India and also that of the Pakistan governments. The bureaucratic process of aiming at regulating the human mobility worsened the further prospect of cultivators, traders, and others. Lack of economic opportunities fueled cross-border movement of people, and this in turn strengthened Assamese political opposition against in-migration. By 1950, this came to be debated under the shadow of citizenship. With the introduction of passport and visa system, an increasing flow of people into Assam, particularly into Kachar, the southernmost district, became noticeable. The 1951 census estimated the figure at a little less than 0.1 million. This number was soon contested by different organizations that hinted at a much higher figure. The official process of issuing passports and visas took a long time. The tea planters in Tripura, unaccustomed to such bureaucratic high-handedness, were the first to express their uneasiness with the new system. They found that it gave rise to transport difficulties. particularly in procuring coal from Pakistan-run East Bengal railways. Urgent restoration of transport link between Bengal and Assam came as a breather to the Assam tea planters. The fate of millions of small peasants producing jute was, however, different. A small-scale jute mill would be established in Assam in the 1950s, but that did not stabilize the jute economy. In addition, the families that had been split across the borders were affected as more restrictions were imposed on those needing to cross the borders on a daily basis. Splitting of families meant the division of immovable properties, including agricultural lands. Farmers had to take permission from both the sides to carry back their agricultural produce. In 1950, cultivators were allowed to carry approximately 1,400 kgs of paddy across the Assam, East Pakistan, Tripura East Pakistan borders. This system continued well into 1954. As both India and Pakistan took control over their respective borders, little was done to preserve pre-partition connections. This meant that everyday family relationship and ownership of agricultural fields and commons along the border acquired new meanings, hardly comprehensible to thousands of inhabitants. Assam was also deprived of its access to the major ports of Chittagong and Calcutta, the road to the later lay through East Pakistan, and the Brahmaputra lost its centrality as an artery of trade. Most hill areas remain geographically isolated. The economic challenges for Assam never dissipated, and the dislocation in communication and transport is still await redress today. Thank you so much. I'll be very happy to get your ideas, questions, comments, criticisms. All are welcome. Thank you so much.
So Raghavan's work, Second World War and the Making of Modern South Asia, something you brought out very well is not only the scale of devastation in Assam, but the fact that the battles of Kohima and Imphal were very decisive. They were among the worst defeats inflicted on the Japanese Imperial Army. And this huge flood of refugees, about 80,000 people died. Many, incidentally, were Tamil and Telugu. And the war also plays a role perhaps in transforming or in shaping the post-war mind. Many of the areas which are marked by insurgency, both in Burma and India, are areas where there was very important recruitment for the war. So you think the larger implication of your work, important as it is for Assam, reminds us of the centrality of war, directly and indirectly, in the emergence of, post-45 India, South Asia. I'd like to expand a little on this. It emerges particularly strongly in the parts you've read out.
Yeah. In fact, this was the reason why I thought this book, which should have actually begun from 1947, the story should begin from 1942. In fact, you rightly pointed out the extraordinary migration of the Indians from Burma. In fact, that process actually began in 1930s because the rise of Burmese nationalism against the Indian settlers, it really began to unfold. And it was in 1942, it took a tragic turn. Unfortunately, the people who moved, for them, it was really a short gap. They don't have any access. All the existing transport mechanism through which they could move to India, it was stopped, right? There is no access to them. What was the alternative for them? They had to walk now. And these were the routes they were unfamiliar with, the language they were unfamiliar with. And it was extremely hostile geography, rains, and they don't know the localities, and also other kind of difficulties. But there are digressions. There wasn't one Assamese gentleman who was a rich trader who would collect cloths woven in that region in Assam. He would take them to Burma and other areas. He actually took care. Really, it was happy end for him. He came back on his elephant, walking and talking to the local people. He was quite familiar with the local culinaries, all the plants he was familiar with, languages he was familiar with, and he became a hero in the local community the way. But for most of the Indians, it was an extraordinary crisis. It also helped the Indians to be part of the how you extend support to the refugees. Stalwarts, extended particularly by the Birlas, right? They actually established camps in Assam to give extension. But I think this was for the first time the Indian Congress leaders in particular, they got exposed to the vulnerability of that regions, that how these regions can play a very important role. The war's importance has now been increasingly being recognized by the global military historians. This war of 1944 is now being voted by many agencies. This is one of the major wars of the world. And it also signaled the departure or the withdrawal of the British power from that regions. It was essentially a very, very fateful situations for them. But the war also created an objective situation, and the weapons, the militarizations of that area, and also that these regions would remain vulnerable from the perspective of strategy, military strategies. That became part of the psychology of the early batches of the Indian Republic, politicians of the Indian Republic. The local politicians, bureaucrats, they kept on discussing about these issues in the 40s continuously about that. And we see that this was the same territory, same geography, same trajectory, where some of the biggest challenges to the Indian Republic emerged in the later decades, particularly the Naga question. The Nagas' extraordinary challenge to the Indian Republic in the 1950s to the Nehru's government. It actually it began to build up around this political and trails that was laid behind this Second World War. I would definitely see that this war definitely requires and close integrations with our historical imaginations. Without taking this war into confidence and its consequences, I personally feel that our decolonization, history of decolonization would be untold, and or it will be only partially told. I don't know whether I have been able to explain to you.
Thank you. That was a fascinating talk. Two things. One question, more of a comment, I guess, but connected is one is this the Burma connection. That one of the biggest populations which walked back from Burma was the Tamil population. That even now in More, which is the town just as soon as the first town as you enter in Manipur is still Tamil, majority Tamil. That they have a very large Tamil population. So, because Burma had a very large Tamil population, and even now it does. There is still Tamils in Burma. So, but the thing is, what I want to ask is that was there the thing there was a very definite idea or a consciousness of themselves as Tamil. Not, I mean, as Indian, definitely the Indian was there, because of other reasons. But, definitely there was a consciousness of themselves as Tamil. Now, how does that play out, with regard to Assam? In the sense that in the period that you are talking about, right? Especially, I mean, I'm talking about, prior to the kind of negotiations, you're talking, about the Garo Hills, with the Bordoloi Commission, etc., etc. What was the idea of, did they identify themselves, or was there an Assam idea, or was it, a kind of, a conglomeration or different, identities, that was there. Of course, in Tamil too, it's not that, other castes or thing was not there, but there was definitely an idea of Tamil or Tamilness, if you want. So how does that play out in Assam?
I think the idea of Assamese or being an Assamese, right? It was definitely there, but it was more fluid than what a Tamil or Telugu identity would be because of the geographical locations and the ways that Assamese would have to interact with many others, the powerful presence, particularly of many tribal communities in that regions who spoke really powerful language, who are equally competent, skilled in terms of their ability to negotiate with environment, with nature, economic structures. So the Assamese identity was definitely fluid, but it was definitely there. It was more in terms of a literary and cultural identity, but largely in the political field, it would be back and forth, more accommodations. I would say that from the 1930s, 40s onward, I may be wrong, but I would say that at least through strong consolidation, through strong process of consolidation of this identity. One, I would say the strong Assamization of the government machinery, more number of people who would control the bureaucratic process of the bureaucratic element of Republic of India. They are more in numbers. They began to play an important role. But I think the cultural institutions, they also became equally significant. The 20th century is also the rise and the super rise of the Assamese literary histories. I think that obviously consolidated the cultural idea of a community more cohesively, more comprehensively. But in contrast to that, Assam as a cultural unit in the British time, it began to falter primarily because it was not a cohesive cultural entity. It was, the process of creation of modern Assam, it essentially took place in the 19th century. It was the 19th century Assam is, remarkably different from that of what it was in the 18th century. So the push and pull, I think a permutation combination, that process began to happen in 19th century, but it began to unfold again during the process of decolonization. I would say that decolonization of second half of the 20th century is also this new permutation and combinations that began to happen in the 19th century.
Gaurav, then you, ma'am, and then you, sir.
Thank you, Rupda, for introducing us to your book. It's fascinating, and I'd love to read it. So I'm asking two questions, and they are broad. So it's up to you whether you would want to take this up right now or not. One of the things that really stood out for me is that you give us a very rich sense of the fluid geographies of Assam in the two passages that you read out. And yet you also write somewhere that the partition mutilated the geography of mainland Assam, indicating that you, and more importantly, the peoples that you study, have some sense of what is the definitive geography of Assam. So given so, can I ask can you just give us some further sense of the spatial context, and perhaps more importantly, the overlapping and competing spatial imaginations of what is Assam, both for the peoples of the region and for the peoples of the rest of India, because you also indicate that it's only during the World War II that Assam begins to figure more centrally in mainland Indian imagination, right? So that's my first question. And the second, I want to build from Mahesh's question. How would you juxtapose the story that you tell us about the lowland-upland relations, especially you're saying that after partition, the hill tracts get more isolated, how would you juxtapose it to James Scott's Art of Not Being Governed, where he writes about similar regions, and that one too, where he basically argues that the post-1945 state is so powerful that the concept of Zomia doesn't really hold. It's a pre-45 concept, where you seem to be making a reverse argument that with partition, these areas become more isolated for some time. So how would you juxtapose the two? Where does your history, how does your history complicate that work? Thank you so much.
I don't know whether I'll be in a position to answer your questions. These are difficult questions, but let me just try. I begin with your second question first. You know, for a long period, parts of that regions, it was obviously ruled in a very completely different way from that of mainland India. For example, let us go back to the early 19th century. When one part of modern Meghalaya, Garu Hills, right, the British East India Company wanted to govern, it did not want to apply the regulations of Bengal because they thought the residents there, the economic systems there, they're completely unfit for the Bengal regulations, that they require a separate set of regulations. Then obviously, throughout the late 19th and well into 1935, range of bureaucratic and cultural principles would be applied to that regions to incorporate more areas or to loosely govern those areas. For example, Eastern Himalaya, it would not be governed well into the early 20th century. Even the British military expeditions to the Eastern Himalaya, it continued well into the 1911. But 1935, when the Government of India Act was passed, how to govern those territories, it became one of the most controversial and contested subject for the British government. So they introduced this mechanism, partially governed and ungoverned, right? Some parts would, for Meghalaya and others, they would be governed, but they would not come under any kind of political regulations. Eastern Himalaya, which is modern Arunachal Pradesh, it will remain outside it, outside any kind of direct rule. So even, in fact, till 1961, no census was taken in Arunachal Pradesh, right? So this complex bureaucratic political institutions which were given birth to, which were introduced or projected into those areas, particularly to the hills, it really created a complex form of governance of that territory, which was unlike in Burma or other places where their Jumia idea is more applicable there. But here, sometimes of governance, sometimes not. But it did not mean that those areas were isolated. For example, Eastern Himalaya, which is my more favorite area, it contributed largely to the profit, and also it remained part of the global commodity circuit. For example, Eastern Himalaya, it used to send Coptis theta. It will be sending India's Ficus elastica, right? And they were really source of great earning for the Marwari businessmen, the British businessmen based in Calcutta, and they were part of the global circuit. So no governance did not mean they were isolated, right? It was obviously the process of integration was going on. But there were also sites of many religious, cultural practices. For example, Tawang, which was a very complex area where one of Asuka's colleague, right, Sargojyoti, has done exemplary work, right? So those were also complex territories, right? The Buddhist practices and other kind of, and these are also at a very fragile and fuzzy areas, right? Their political histories kept on fluctuating in the 19th century, and they began to take shape in the 20th century. Now, how to govern these territories in post-independent era, 1947? This definitely became a very complex and challenging subject. I would say that with the partition, and with massive disjuncture or dislocation of the existing networks of communication transport. And why I'm saying, a typically resident of Assam, for them, the basic route is via, say, Kusbihar to Delhi. This is the route that we are so familiar with, right? Many of us do travel by rail, by road, and by even by air. That is the truth. But for example, the residents of the Khasi and the Jaintia Hills, for them, it is the southward journey via Mymensingh, Sylhet, to onward Bengal, to the larger Bengal economic network. The oranges produced in Khasi and Jaintia Hills, they would found the most ready market in the Bengal's, Calcutta's urban houses, right? Now, suddenly these are disrupted. Indian government, Assam government did not have the resources, capacities to closely intensify the route building or recreation of transport mechanism in the late 1940s and 50s, because it was such an fragile and it was such a disruptive economy, right? So it will take some time, and that's why these regions remain largely isolated again in the 50s and the 60s, but over a period of time, with the creation of smaller states, I think they became more powerful in terms of its governance, political, their integration with the Republic of India, it became more consolidated, more powerful. I don't know whether I have answered your second questions, but coming back to your first question, did I forget your first question? Right. No, I think it is absolutely fluid and it is absolutely complex, right? As I hinted in my previous component, I said that my connections with Calcutta is more formidable for me, but for many, probably living those who are in the, say, Tawang region, those who are raising in the, say, in the extreme eastern border of Assam, their connections, mobilities are different, right? Not necessarily one needs to look in the westward direction. They can look into the southward, they can look northward, right? The special imaginations obviously would vary depending on their ethnic, linguistic, economic connections, right? These are extremely important. And also it follows many, many routes. This is not only that one thing, these are not to be seen only through the prism of national highways. There needs to be also seen through many micro routes created by nature, created by products of other offshoots, right? I think we need to see in that directions. I would rather suggest that we really cannot bring one single macro idea to imagine or to understand one region's history, right? There should be many flows, many directions. As a historian, I think it is important for us to pay attention to all these dimensions, every aspect. And I would also suggest that as a historian, we should also see how it varies according to years. Probably every decade it changes, every year it changes, depending on larger circumstances. It can be political, it can be economic, it can be many ways, right? So this is how, and I think the archives are best for capturing these ideas in a powerful way, right? Thank you so much.
It's just occurring to me, a very fine book which came out 2 years ago, In the Name of the Nation, Sanjeev Barua. And one of the points he makes is how, and this doesn't apply to the Northeast, that there are excluded areas, partially excluded areas, the agency tract, and one may add princely states. So princely states, there's the Shan states and Tripura, Manipur. Excluded, partially excluded areas are there in other parts of India. Agency, there's FATA in the northwest. There's the northern sarkars in the south. So British Indian Empire has a very sophisticated means of control. But put another way, there are limits to what one may call the district magistrate, superintendent of police, collectorate model, the Sonipat model, if you like. And particularly in areas where the geography is intractable, or the surplus is perhaps not in the farm produce, or which are border areas. So it's not a coincidence, because you said Tawang, that this multiple jurisdiction of Tawang is contested with Tibet. And within historical moments, 1830s, it was true with Ladakh. So the complexity of British control has cast a shadow in the post-imperial period. It's not a coincidence these are areas which become hotspots or which become complex, because the states that emerge after, the successor states, also have problems. They try to extend, if you like, crudely put, the Sonipat, or if you like, the Hooghly model into these areas, and it'll never work. Sorry, I just provoked. It's a fantastic question. We should engage in this. Ma'am, I'm sorry, you've been very patient. Please identify yourself and go.
Thank you. I'm Ritika. I'm a TF in the philosophy department, but I'm from Assam. So thank you for this talk. I was just wondering if you had something to say about how the Assamese identity was negotiated between the Ahom community and the caste Hindu Assamese, because they're certainly not uniform, but they're also peculiarly different in that they're not strictly hierarchical either. So I was wondering what you had to say about that, especially in the context of the subsequent sort of Hinduization of Assam. And I'm not sure if the question is best directed at this talk, but yeah.
Your question has partly been addressed by historian Yasmin Saikia previously. Let me focus 1940s and the 1950s. This is the time period that I'll be more comfortable with. 1940s, the Ahom community, they obviously, as he asked me, they also had their own ambitions, right? What should be their future, right? Anyway, they were one of the most powerful community who ruled that territory for a long period, right? Those memories were very much well played out, right? Now in the 1940s, with the powerful political leaders, their spokespersons, they began to negotiate very intensely with Congress, with the Muslim League, with the imperial government, and to create a specific place within the schema of Assamese political future, right? But obviously those were tiny voices. Many Ahom members, right? They were also followers of Congress, right? There are political groups who did not follow the Congress route, that were followers of Ahom Sabha, which was one of the political entity, but it was not as powerful, organized like the Congress party. They had their own followers nonetheless. But your question is, and they had obviously kept on fluctuating within as a Congress follower, or as a followers of Communist Party, or as an even close ally with the Muslim League for a very brief period. They intensely negotiated with. They also negotiated with Bordelais Committee also, that what would be their future in that. But these are largely of memory, largely about their 18th century legacies about that. But now these are hard realities of the 40s, 50s, and that, right? In fact, as I said, to Ravindran's questions, and as an answer to him, right, that Assamization of the government machinery began to intensify, began to take an initial process during this process also. So uneasiness, then also at different layers, cultural, social, and intellectual layers, right? Many layers of exchanges, many layers of unhappiness, many layers of discomfort. These negotiations began to happen. In fact, in the 1940s and the 50s, communists, post-independent, in fact, communists became the more powerful representative of the Ahoms, because they thought the Congress may not be the right party for them. It was not because of their cultural identity, but largely as a inability of the Congress party to resolve their economic and other questions. The communists provided them certain answers, right? As a peasant, as a farmer, they became this thing. But I think over a period of time, the alliances at the cultural level, at a religious level, this became much more strengthened, much more competent. And the Ahom identity post 1967, when one of the last time they competed more as an ethnic group, more as a community, and linguistic community, right? Tai Ahom Rajya Parikhod, right? I think they began to disappear, they began to lose their popularity, and I think they increasingly part of the larger political entities post 1967. Yeah, and obviously 80s, 90s, they would have different kind of ambitions, different kind of desires, but essentially everybody would be negotiating with the larger ideas. Thank you so much.
Can you, yeah, right. Yeah, so I'll keep it quick. My name is Jyotirmoy. I have one question which sort of connects two questions. It actually stemmed from Ravindran's question about, or rather your response to the question about the consolidation of the Assamese identity, the language, and the question of the language and the literature, right? And also now sort of goes back to the question that she asked, because how I'm understanding this is that she's asking about the pre-colonial period, largely the Ahom interaction with the caste Hindu, and your response about Assamese identity. And here, my question is about the gap in the period. So about the 100 odd years before your book begins. So I'm thinking about the 1826 movement in Assam, and particularly for language, 1836, 1873, then of course, Ohomia Bhasha Unnoti Hadini Sabha 1888, and the Ahom Sahitya Sabha in 1917. So my question is very simple, which is that since you have dealt with 1942 and beyond, largely the post-colonial, the questions of identity, questions of politics, do you plan a prequel to this whole discussion, which could be something around 1826, 1836, to say where this book began? I know you have looked at the history of peasant movements from 1900, and the ecological history from 1826, but I'm looking more at a question of language and the literary history around from 1826. That is the question. Thank you.
I think historians should really look at long-term histories, the long-term views, right? Probably it is better to write a long history of the Assamese literature. Say, why not 13th century to the 18th century? Or 13th century to the 19th century. That may be a better way to think about that. So these bureaucratic interventions introduced by the company government, probably it was only a small departure, a small hole. If we read the long literary histories, which in fact the literary archive for the 14th to the 18th century is too rich, too powerful, and too complex, right? That will give us much more fascinating history. And then probably some of the questions that we keep on asking for the 19th century, maybe that would answer would be. So answer should be, I am not interested in those company interventions. Probably I'm more interested in the long literary archives of the previous centuries.
After you, sir, we'll have two questions from the people on Zoom. Please go ahead.
Professor, hello, I'm Krishanu. My question is on what has not been written, basically. The question is, why was it a deliberate and informed choice to limit it to 2000?
It was a very deliberate decision for one simple reason. Historians should stop somewhere. We are always interested, say 1851 to 1878. This is 2000 for two important reasons. One is a new political situations. A new Congress story had begun to develop. The implications of the 80s and 90s economic policies began to unfold differently in beginning in 2000s. Political rebels, they also began to retreat in a more aggressive manner during those periods. And I was a direct participant of this last 2 decades to the larger development. So I thought that I should not come into that time more directly. Archives are also limited. We don't have any access to the archive. Officially, archives are allowed only before 30 years. I think that is one of the major reasons. and also convenience. 2000 is a good choice. And also there's most spectacular development. The Satya is definitely a better thing for me to conclude the book. I'm sure future historian will begin in between, probably say 1980 to 2020, something like that. But thank you so much.
On a lighter note, the book stops at page 852. Could have gone on to 853, 850. Quickly, and then we'll take 2 questions from there. We'll take all 3.
Hello, am I audible? I don't know if this qualifies as a question, but this was just a thought. So the book is called The Quest for Modern Assam, and it's a contemporary history of Assam as well. I was wondering if you'd like to reflect on and problematize these categories of periodization themselves, modern and contemporary, because there is so much of the modern that carries itself into the contemporary, and there are disjunctions as well, as you pointed out. So if you'd like to reflect on that in the context of the history that you've written. And the question that follows from that is that you've said that while at one level it's a history of the making of modern Assam, it's also about its contribution to the making of the Indian Republic. And that, I feel, has also almost become a teleological mode as far as a lot of contemporary history is concerned. Are there other paradigms also that we can think of while writing history of regions which do not kind of fit within that framework of the making of the Republic? Those were 2 questions that I had.
I think modern, the choice of the word, it was largely out of modern for me. We have been using this word modern largely as a contemporary. Even in the 19th century, historians began to write about modern times. There are definitely deep cultural, intellectual engagement with this category. It's largely seen as an post-reform period, post-Renaissance period, right? This is how it is being used. But for me, I thought that this is a better way, because this was a time when at least the literary historians and other practitioners of literature, those who were writing, say, poetry, poem, novels, they were largely concerned with these questions and in a more profound manner. And one of my chapter 6 is about the quest for modern Assam. For me, that modernity begins with the establishment of an university, the discoveries of your histories, the way you are writing about yourself. I think that became, and those contradictions that it carried with them. So I thought that for me, and I have been facing these questions, why you are using this modern, right, from many others, right? But I thought for me, it actually translates into contemporary. And I'm sure centuries later, this will be seen in a different way. Republic, obviously, it was one choice, but there can be other choices also. It is also the history of decolonization. It is also the moment of creation of, say, new economic patterns for many Indian states, creation of economic inequalities, that can be also one of the paradigm, or also the long histories. But I think the as we are largely dealing with 1947, the making of Republic is definitely still one of the less understood process. We essentially try to understand the making of modern Republic through the lenses of certain states, certain big economics, and certain big political ideas. How every region contributed and salience these ideas, right, in different ways. The vernacular ideas or regional language ideas of politics, for example, these are also equally important to the making of Republic of India, right? And these ideas became extremely troublesome, contested in 1980s, 1970s, right? For example, one of the outcome of the much talked about Assam movement of 1979 to 1985 is actually changing the discourse of Indian citizenship. Immediately after the movement came to conclusions and political accords were concluded between the leaders of the movement and the union government, this was intensely debated. What does citizenship mean in the floor of the Indian parliament, right? So I think every region has significantly contributed to the consolidation or reworking of the idea of Republic of India. I thought that this can be one way. I'm sure others will take up other paradigms, other windows to look at that time in different ways, and probably they will find different answers. This is only one way, and I'm very sure other historians will have disagreement, in a great disagreement with some of my conclusions, some of my archives, and some of my findings. But this is how the discipline grows, right? We are here to unlearn ourselves and to keep on following the right path, right? Good history should be written in that way, right? This is what I believe, right? I must have the ability and willingness to learn from the others' criticisms and open up to new ideas.
Much as I'd love to continue, we are almost at 3 o'clock. Before we conclude, I want to very sincerely thank Dr. Kanika Singh, the staff, the very energetic members of the Center for Writing and Communication, Deepa Bhatnagar, the staff, the energetic, equally energetic members of the Ashoka Archives, and everyone who's joined us. I have come up with a very interesting discovery. Professor Saikia's last book, The Unquiet River, was 473 pages. The text of this book is 545 pages, and the actual length is 843. So the rest of it is annotations and extremely detailed footnotes. This book has 200 plus pages of footnotes. It could qualify as a monograph in itself. Most monographs are 200 pages. I do think it's very important to emphasize there are many histories of independent India which are very high quality. There are very good histories which are of provinces and regions. This one sets a new standard in terms of the breadth and the depth of its archival work. It also is significant. This is not simply a history of the Brahmaputra, Barak Valley of Assam as it is today. It looks in substantive detail, not only at the relationships with what is now Bangladesh, became East Pakistan in 47, but also at all the states that were carved out of Assam, and at the relationship of Assam with India, South Asia, and the larger region as a whole, Southeast Asia, China. And in a sense, I think this book sets a new, if you like, I don't know if the right word is the gold standard, but it sets a new standard for how histories can be written. And it suggests many new questions. And I think many of the questions that came up today offer starting points for other new kinds of history. And that's what good history is about. It doesn't answer questions, it also raises them. So thank you very much. And please do come back and spend more time at Ashoka. Questions? We're almost out of time. We can have one question. Anyone wants to raise one question?
Hello, sir.
Please go ahead.
Sir, my name is Diptiman Gautam. I'm a research scholar from the Department of English, Guwahati University. Sir, I have two questions. Well, sir, you mentioned the story from Patkai, Novosar Hipare. It's very interesting. Thank you for bringing it up. Sir, I wanted to ask about, sir, the Assamese community in Burma before around 1940s. Sir, where did they come from? Did they come from as war prisoners during the Anglo-Burma wars, or were they brought about as indentured laborers? What is the history of the Assamese in Burma? We know about the South Indians, but what about the Assamese? And sir, secondly, I have a question that's kind of controversial. Actually, I wanted to know if you have found any information on it. Sir, I wanted to, this is about the Assam Andolan. Sir, in the Assam Andolan, do you see a shift from it being a all outsider movement to an anti-Bengali Muslim movement? And especially, sir, the role of Joynath Sharma and the volunteer force in the way, do you see any role of the SSB, the Special Service Bureau, and sir, its role in establishing the kind of the Hindu movement in Assam through VHP and other establishments? Sir, if you could comment on those things. I know they're disconnected, but sir, I'm very curious. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Very quickly, as far as my understanding and archives tell us, that the Assamese speakers in Burma, they were primarily war booties. They are not indentured workers, because Burma, there are obviously very few individuals, but they were mostly the people who were taken during the war of 1821. The second, I think, that process of 1979 and 80, it began to happen and unfold at different level. We really need to discover good archives to have a very convincing answer to this. But one thing was very clear. During the early days of negotiations between Mrs. Indira Gandhi, the Prime Minister, and the leaders of the movement, Mrs. Gandhi was very categorical. She made this point very clear, which was reported very well in several national dailies of 1980 of the month of January, that Mrs. Gandhi will not have a negotiation if the movement is against Indians. That negotiation was that statement from Mrs. Gandhi was very much there. So I think it took a lot of political and other kind of behind the skin negotiations. And obviously I don't have an archive. I should not answer these things categorically, but this process began to happen from and Bidehi. Bidehi includes everyone who are living in Assam, who are basically maybe a Marwari, a Hindi speaker from Bihar, right? Everyone, to specifically from those who migrated to Assam from East Bengal and East Pakistan. I think that became the central point. This happened largely January 1980, and it became more intensified during the process of unfolding and unpacking of the movement between 1981 and 1982. There are many players, but unless and until we have very convincing archive, we should, I refrain from answering these questions. My chapter on the Assam movement has tried to give some hint to these questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.